Great. Thank you so much. It's such a great pleasure to be here. I appreciate the invitation. I'm also deeply appreciating the other presenters. It's really fantastic to see this movement that's taking place about finding a wiser and more effective way to work. And this is a topic that's extremely important to me. The presenting topic is the hybrid workplace, but of course, hybrid workplace is a shorthand for the effects on the workplace of a much larger set of change. We are living in a deeply historical period. Obviously, in addition to COVID, it is deeply historical period in politics, technology, society, and climate. Very clearly, we're coming to an inflection point where what's coming will be different than what used to be, and that what used to work actually no longer works. And so, now's the time. We need to really create new ways of working, and that new way of working should then feed these larger systems. So for today, we're going to be talking about where my stuff fits within the other talks is to really address the knowing doing gap. And Juha and Gita's presentations, everything they talked about is absolutely true. And it was so wonderful to see some of the research I was involved in and some of the names of my former colleagues come up with the Google research around psychological safety. And it's really hard to do. It's extraordinarily difficult to do, particularly during times of great change and emergence and upheaval. So that's what we're going to be talking about today. As an engineer, as a leader, I believe if we understand how things work, we can then use that knowledge to achieve our goals. And that extends to our inner lives, our cognitive processes, and our emotions, things that in the history of business and leadership have been viewed as either irrelevant, but as we see from the other presentations, they're actually becoming quite relevant. And we'll be looking at this mostly through the lens of neurobiology. And as Juha pointed out, he used the word VUCA, volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. Again, this state of not only change, but also accelerating change, this sense of causality, is almost as if cause and effect are becoming less and less of a thing, more difficult to predict the future, which is the reason why the image shows going around a blind corner. So let's think for a second, as humans, what's our relationship to rapid change, to not knowing, of things being difficult to plan, of systems that worked in the past stopping to work? Right, is we don't like it, right, on a biophysical level. And the reason why we don't like it is that we are the descendants of nervous monkeys, right? The chilled out California monkeys didn't make it. We as a species have really benefited from freaking out early and often. And our neurobiology reflects this. It's a vast oversimplification, but nonetheless, still useful to think of our brains within our skulls as actually three brains. We have the brainstem and the cerebellum that we share with lizards. This is very much the reflex part of the brain. It's the four F's: fight, flight, freeze, find a mate. And this part of the brain can actually take over the rest of the body and the mind during times of emergency. If you've ever involuntarily, non-cognitively removed your hand from a hot stove or jumped out of the way of something without any conscious thought, you've experienced the way that these systems take over the lizard brain. There's the paleomammalian brain, where we have very strong emotion. And then we have the human part of the brain, the prefrontal cortex and the cerebellum, which handles a lot of our abstract work, our analysis, our communication. And what's interesting is that the older parts of the brain are very low latency. They come on immediately. But they're also not accurate. This is why frequently these are false alarms, what's called negativity bias in psychology. And then they actually turn off the more modern parts of the brain. So let's very, very quickly think of an example about how this works. So imagine a mouse. A mouse pops out of the mouse hole. It perceives the cat. When it sees the cat, a whole number of systems automatically, without volition, turn on. And these have the effect of allowing the mouse to jump back quicker into the mouse hole, right? So its eyes dilate, its digestion stops suddenly, its heart starts beating faster, and a whole bunch of chemicals that allow it to move faster are dumped into its system. And as a result, it survives. Now, what's really notable is that Mr. Mouse or Ms. Mouse, upon stopping to see the visual stimuli, those systems turn off, they quiesce. And that's important because this fight or flight mode, while useful, is also literally poisonous. Now, let us imagine this mouse with a human brain. Later that night, the mouse would be in bed, trying to go to sleep. And instead of sleeping, it starts imagining possible futures where it's going to see the cat tomorrow, and the cat's going to kill it tomorrow. Or the cat is going to make it look bad in front of the other mice, including that very attractive mouse, or maybe the mouse will get fired from his mouse job. Now, even though the mouse is safe in bed, it's in a context that's quite safe. These same fight or flight systems can be started by just our imagination, right? And so we think about innovation and the need to change things. We begin to see a very complicated relationship with our beautiful human ability to think and ideate and create, and its relationship to our neurobiology, right? And so now let's look at this with regard to innovation. Some of you that are familiar with design method may recognize this. This is one of IDEO's simplified versions of their design method: to empathize, define, ideate, prototype, and test. So let's look at what happens to these when the body is experiencing fight or flight systems and that prefrontal cortex is essentially turned off, either completely or partially. Empathize, instead of the ability to expansively think about how other people experience the universe, it becomes I, me, mine. We think about our own personal survival, our departmental survival. Our sense of the greater good becomes secondary. When it comes to defining a problem under stress, very frequently we mistake what's actually going on for what we think should be going on or what has gone on in the past, right? We solve the problems of the last war, to use military terminology. We all know how hard it is when you're overly stressed to ideate and come up with new ideas. And then for prototype and test, essentially this means to fail over and over and over in front of other people, right? So, if you've had a sinking feeling that things are really difficult, just know that your perceptions are accurate. And the purpose of this talk is to say, let's just make our peace with it. So thank you. I appreciate your attention. And hang on, there's more slides. No, there's absolutely stuff that we can do about this. And the reason why we can do this is via the magic of neuroplasticity. Neuroplasticity is the ability of the human nervous system to change its function and its structure. You actually change the physical structure of your nervous system by thinking repeated ways. And this is quite different than what I learned in undergrad. And so what this means then is that the skills that then enable everything you saw in the previous two presentations are trainable. And this is hopeful, and this is amazing. And I can share with you, in my life, this has been transformational to go out and say, I want to get better at this, and I'm going to train myself in it. And so we're going to talk about 3 ways that you can train yourself in it. So first is to actually know your level of stress. And the reason why this is important is we can see here, this is brand new research. No, it's not. It's from 1908. We've known this forever. Is that when you have too little stress, you're bored, you're disengaged. As the stress level rises, right, you begin to get the benefits of the stress system: increased attention, focus, energy, a sense of purpose, cognitive abilities, increased visual acuity, But when it goes too far, again, that fight or flight lizard brain begins to shut down the human prefrontal cortex. And of course, then stopping the very things that we need to do to be able to innovate. And of course, as I mentioned, over the long term, these systems are poisonous, and the body actually is able to give out, actually begins to give out. And this is where you see um, medical leave and things like that. Very quickly, another way of looking at this information is Csikszentmihalyi's work on flow state. Flow state is that feeling of when you get lost in your work, when time flies away, you feel very dialed in. And you can see at the dot in the lower right, you're in that flow channel where you have the correct balance of challenge. And then sometimes if the challenge is increased on you, let's say because the world is going crazy, hypothetical example, then you end up in that anxiety realm. And the correct thing to do then is to increase your skills so you can get back into that flow state. And of course, also is if you're in the flow state and you get good at something, it becomes boring because your skills have increased, and that's the point when then you want to increase that challenge. And as Yuha mentioned, humans are terrible at knowing where we are on our stress levels. This is a meme that was very popular at Google. Humans are very resilient and we can just acclimate and we stop noticing. I mean, the way that the prefrontal cortex filters information is if the information is already there, is always there, it's not interesting, right? And we acclimate to this. So then the question then is then how can we know what our stress level is? And expanding on one of Yuha's answers, and this is what we taught at Google, three ways of knowing your stress. One is repeating thoughts. If you have a tape loop of a repeating thought that doesn't go anywhere, right? A rumination, this is frequently stressful. This is an example of what's called the default mode network in the brain turning on. So if you just notice you're having repeating thoughts that don't go anywhere. The second, as Johan mentioned specifically, is sensations in the body. Research around emotion posits that every emotion has a physical correlate, a sensation. And there's very interesting research that shows that across cultures, and interestingly, Finland was one of the cultures that was studied, that show that people tend to feel the same types of simulations, of sensations rather. In English, there's a term called a tell. If someone is playing poker and they bluff, they lie, frequently they'll have some little sign that they're doing it. So if you can learn your own body's tells, you can actually begin your monitoring. And then third is mood. And a lot of times we can recruit other people who can tell us our moods. Sometimes it's annoying if someone says, you're really stressed out, and you go, I am not. Nonetheless, the ability to either perceive your own moods or to recruit other people to help you perceive your own is a great way of knowing where you are on that continuum. The second key is then how do you manage your stress? So if we look back here at the Yerkes-Dodson stress arousal curve, what do you do? Like I think the far more common use case in the business world is that if you're in the stressed and restless. So if using key one, you say, oh, I'm in the stressed portion, I want to be in the optimal portion, you need to do something. And the good news is that it can be lots of different things and they're different for different people. So while I read what's going on for Google, I would invite people to in the Presmos to answer that: what decreases your stress level? Right? To just actually think about it, to say, oh, when I'm in this situation, this is what I'm going to do. And while those are coming in, I'll share with you from Google research what was most reported effective at Google. Number one, by far, spending time with friends and family. And what's interesting, particularly in the Silicon Valley culture, is spending time at work is considered really important, and that you might be doing something wrong if you're spending time with friends and family. Nonetheless, amongst high-performing people at Google, this was the number one thing that they said was positive for them. The second is positive work experience. This speaks a little bit to what Gita was pointing at, which basically means is your work meaningful? And actually, Ruha's research also pointed to this. And do you like the people you work with, right? And those are things where psychological safety is an emergent quality of that. Sleep, so basic, so fundamental. Google actually invests quite a bit on cognitive behavioral therapy apps around sleep, as well as making napping and sleeping at work culturally um, uh, okay. Moving the body, which is different than exercising and going to the gym, walking meetings, meditation. And there was research around boundaries around work and work non-work time, absolutely crucial in the hybrid work environment. The research was clear that showed that people, although it's okay to integrate your work and your non-work times, people who separate have a boost to happiness without a decrease in quality. And maybe most important, we can see this from the list, is that there's a long list. Underwater basket weaving, sauna. One of my Finnish colleagues, his favorite thing was sauna and sausage. That was, his eyes lit up when he had the opportunity to do that. And I see this coming in on the list. We have traveling, breathing exercises, silence or music, depending on the mood, walking in the forest, affirmation support, spending time with God, nature, letting it all out. Very interesting research on the science of awe around this. Awe being as described as understanding our place in the universe, that there are things that there are much larger than us. This actually feels very empowering. Physical activity, therapy, getting to know yourself, live music. So I think the takeaway from this point is that what you can do varies widely, right? The most important thing is that you have the trigger of it's time to do this and I'm going to do it. Yeah, washing dishes. Boy, what a great one that is, right? Imagine if we have the opportunity during, fairly mundane parts of our life to actually frame them as refreshing. I love doing chores like washing dishes. A lot of my work is very abstract. And so for me to go suddenly be like, it was dirty and now it's clean is actually quite satisfying. Yeah, daydreaming, time off task. Wonderful, thank you. Um, and so the last E is going to be working with other people's emotions, and which is to say, how do we as leaders lead for resilience and innovation? And in some cultures, my understanding is Finnish culture is a little bit like this. Is there is some cultural resistance to talking about or working with emotions, um, and so nonetheless, I think this is really important to begin this vocabulary. And for me, just to identify with this group a little bit, this is why I love teaching this stuff with science, because science makes this feel more real to me. It makes it feel more rational. It makes it seem like my whirlwind of emotion is not um, magic. It's rather a very reasonable biological reaction to complicated stimuli. So when you're leading for resilience, the first thing is to actively manage your own resilience. How you are is more important than what you say. And if what you say doesn't match what you are, then you run afoul of the first two presentations around authenticity and trust. Second is being aware of what up and down regulates others and acting on it. If you're leading a large organization, you can take one action that will have both effects. It's very important to become a student of the people in your organization. And then the third part is to be aware and realistic about how to manage long-term stress and workload. Prioritization. If you're adding a new initiative, what gets deprioritized? Innovation and automation over manual labor. Are you prioritizing those projects and deprioritizing other ones? And then third is clear expectations. Patrick Pichette, the first CFO of Google, declared himself a charter member of the Insecure Overachievers Club. So high achievers frequently will burn themselves out if you don't give them a clear goal line, and low achievers will not achieve enough without this idea of clear expectation. So the hope is that our bodies, as Juha mentioned, have actually not evolved over a very long time. And in many ways, they're a poor fit for the world that we're in now, particularly in this historical moment. However, there are things that you can do to help yourself become a better innovator during times that absolutely need it. So yeah, there's the talk. Thank you for listening, and looking forward to looking at some of the questions.
Thank you very much, Bill. Um, there are several questions via Presemo, and you may be able to see them yourselves too. And if you want, you can also um, uh, choose to answer more of these questions here. There are a few here, and luckily a lot of answers to the questions that you were putting to the audience. Well, if you have something to add on the methods of how to manage stress in terms of how to put the non-important things to the side, it's a broad question, of course, and but do you have something that you would like to say about that?
Yeah, so I like the phrasing of the question, because it's essentially, how does one deprioritize?
Hmm.
I had a boss who gave me a quite provocative phrase early in my career. He said, "It's very important to choose what you're going to fail at." And as someone who I don't like to fail, as a matter of fact, I try to do a lot of things to avoid that. But the reason why he said that was, many times we choose what we're going to succeed at, which implies which we're not going to do, but we don't say it explicitly. And therefore, emotionally, it's very uncomfortable to say, I am not going to do this thing that I could do, or I'm going to stop doing this thing that I used to do. So I think beginning culturally to make it okay to say this is less valuable than it used to be, and also to be very clear about it. As Google went from a relatively small organizations to larger, one of the things, and you begin to rely on other teams, one of the things we're really trying to do is to be very clear about what we're doing and what we're not doing, right? So each team has to prioritize its own work. We had a value that we try and prioritize work that other people are depending on us. But when we decide to not do it, or to delay it, or to do it differently than the people that are requesting it, is to be very, very clear and honest about that. And again, the way to put it is to decide what to fail at.
Yes, prioritization surfaces also in this presentation and thematic, as it tends to do so often, of course. Important part, so important thing in the managing what we will be able to do well, and what we should then be leaving for later times, or maybe for others to do. Um, do you have something else that you wish to say about the methods of how to implement these ideas, or a part of these ideas in a workforce? How to do the implementation?
Yeah. So when we think about implementation, it's important to have a strategy, and then it's important to have an execution plan, and then it's important to pre-think about failure modes so that you can avoid them. So from the strategy side, all three talks have really been this idea of positioning resilience and well-being, not as a nice to have, but actually as a force accelerator for the business. And this is a reason why it's a little controversial. As I mentioned, I spent 9 years at Google in engineering, and then 5 years in HR. I try and keep a lot of these practices in the business and not in HR. The reason for that is that the HR has a tendency to be aligned with healthcare in the US, unfortunately, um, and more about fixing things when people fall off, whereas versus baking it into the business. So there's the strategy side. The implementation side is, you have to make sure that uh, the rewards and incentives programs, both hard and soft, in other words, both uh, who gets promotion, who gets raises, and then who gets recognized as a strong leader, are actually reinforcing these values, right? So if you say, on the one hand, is we really believe in well-being, and then you promote talented jerks, um, that's the part where a lot of these fail, where there's this organizational knowing doing gap. So I'm a big believer in both what behavior are leaders modeling, and then what are the rewards and incentives, and are they in alignment with some of the values that the strategy mentions. And then the third part, really speaking to some of what Geeta said, is for this to be bottom up. Um, I'd say probably I spent half my budget when I was in people operations, not in putting on classes, but in creating community. So that this really got into the day-to-day of the business. You may have heard Google has had 10% projects for people given 10% of their time to work on what they want. I had some thousands of people using their 10% time to take this forward, which of course, I went from managing 160 people in 5 countries and a $500 million budget to managing 6 people. And so the only way that I could actually create change amongst the whole organization was to really do this bottoms-up approach.
Yeah, yeah. And when it comes to those people who have, let's say, something to develop still in their social skills, or might not matter or care so much about how to take others into account properly, I think one of the many experts or leaders who have spoken well about this was already in the 1990s, Jack Welch at GE, who said that, okay, people need to be talented and make the numbers, as he said, succeed in the operations, whatever was the function and the number-based goals that had, but they always definitely absolutely had to conform to the ethical standards, so that there was nothing bad at how they would handle those topics, and that there would be nothing kind of playing behind other people's backs, and some kind of political behavior within the organization that would amount to kind of sub-optimization for their particular units and so on. So
Right.
really important topics for the coherence and the whole kind of machine, so to say, of the organization to really work well in a really human environment as it is supposed to be working. Some questions have still turned up here, later ones. One person would like you to pick three of the top arguments for proper pay leading to job resilience. I wonder if you view pay as such an important part of this equation, or not so much.
No, I think it's very important. I mean, if you look at why people work, it's to make a living, and then people want to optimize for various levels. I think there's a trap to fall into, that more money, more happiness, as the great business school professor Jay-Z pointed out, more money, more problems. And the research backs up Professor Jay-Z in that the incremental happiness per additional unit of money you get from your job tops out once the basics are covered.
Yeah.
And there's some very interesting research about the hedonic treadmill, that if you grow in, that you basically grow into your income, and then when you acclimate to it, you cease to derive pleasure from it. So just to mention that, but then the question is then how, is financial health important? And absolutely it is. At Google, that was actually one of the pillars. It was a little bit controversial, but I ended up really supporting that idea that if you feel safe and secure, going back to the idea of the nervous monkeys, if you feel safe and secure and that your family is safe and secure, the people that you love are safe and secure, that takes a huge cognitive load and a stressor out. And therefore, then you can make arguments for that. But of course, it's also really important to realize to what the negotiating table looks like from the other side. When you're negotiating compensation, you should also be aware of what your market reference point is. When salary decisions are made, they're not based on someone's need. They're based generally on comparables. So I would go into that negotiation knowing if your requests are outside of the comparables, and if they are, maybe look at a different sector or something, or reevaluate your needs.
Yep. Indeed, as our general timeline, looking at the whole event, does have a little bit of time still, maybe one or two questions still. This is extremely interesting, of course. One question is on the challenges skills axis. Would you recommend staying on the borderline of anxiety to not drain, but to train the brain?
Freudian slip, I suppose.
Perhaps.
Yeah. It depends. And this question really speaks to a subtle understanding of what we've been talking about. So, as was mentioned in what Gita spoke about, is that in one of the questions for her talk is the demands in the workplace will ebb and flow, depending on what's going on in the business, events in the world. So we'll say that the inputs, the demands on resilience are not static.
Mm.
However, also our resilience is not static, right? How well did you sleep last night? Are you having relationship issues? Is your kid being terrible? Are you worried about the state of the world? Are you worried about COVID? So it's a very complex relationship around what's available resilience-wise and what the demands are. So to the extent that we have agency, I think it's important for us to be able to assess how much gas is in the tank and then decide how close do we want to do it. And so I'm a huge fan of working really hard. In my 20s, I got into tech from being an administrative assistant, and I was afforded the opportunity to learn to become a systems administrator. My degrees are in anthropology and public policy. And the company went from 700 people to 10,000 in 6 years, and I had this huge opportunity, and I worked my ass off. That was a time when I was in my 20s to really put the pedal to the floor, the accelerator to the floor. Other times, like when my dad died. My dad died when I was at Google, about 3 years into managing Google's hypergrowth, and I ended up one of those people taking medical leave. My resilience was very low, and that was not the time to take on. So it's a very complicated process, and it's very nuanced. And this is why I think understanding how it works is really important, rather than randomly, uh, yeah, just leaving it up to chance.
Yeah, yeah, indeed. Uh, um, One question here: what can we do when implementation doesn't match the company's stated ambition? For example, when a fool, reading from here, a fool gets hired instead of a competent person.
Right. So my interpretation of that question is, but what about reality, right? I think it's important, especially when you set lofty goals and ambitions, to realize, one of the phrases that got used a lot at Google was, no, I think it's a military thing. No plan survives contact with the enemy. No strategy survives contact with the
Yeah,
reality. And of
yeah,
course, we are fallible people. We make mistakes. So if we think about this, we can generalize this question into how do we deal with our mistakes? And this is referred to a little bit earlier. Um, a blame-free after action report, right? Can you, and this is a very hard thing to pull off, and it's an important thing to emphasize, is that can you actually look at mistakes without blame? And this is extraordinarily hard to scale. So the part of Google that I was an engineer in was site reliability engineering, where we designed the systems to avoid outages, and then when outages happen, we use that information to then build the system. And it's really important that there not be a feeling of shame associated with this. So as a way I implemented this is one of my employees, when an adjacent group caused an outage for my service for Gmail, um, he wrote them an email exquisitely detailing how they had screwed up. And this was right after the outage had happened. And I said, how do you think it felt to receive that email? And he looked at me and he said, I don't know, right? This was somebody who was on the spectrum. So the way that we then implemented this is I said, I would like to offer you real-time feedback. This is when I was a line manager, as to when you're being blamey or you're putting people in a position of feeling shame, because that's antithetical to one of the key strategies. So I think it's important, again, to have the value, the notion, to tie it to business success, and then what's some process in the day-to-day of providing corrective action.